Welcome. We're learning Pirkei Avos. This is our second class. We did a little bit of an introduction yesterday, and we read the first Mishnah. And the first Mishnah starts with the tradition that we have that started with God, who gave the Torah to Moshe and the Jewish people, who gave it to Joshua, to the elders, and then the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. And we're in the middle of talking about that. So yesterday we talked about the tradition, how we have an unbroken tradition from Sinai all the way until today. And if you'd like an example of one of the many traditions that we have, from teacher to student, father to son, parent to child, you can look at our last video. In the comments, we posted a link. Rabbi Kellerman did a lot of work, Rabbi Lawrence Kellerman, to show from his Rebbe all the way back to Moshe. It's very interesting. And we started with the commentary of Rabeinu Yonah. So now we're going to continue with the commentary of Rabeinu Yonah in the first Mishnah. So it says, Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. So, ben Torah shebiksav, ben Torah shebal. Now when we say Moshe received the Torah, that doesn't just mean the written 5 books of Moses that's in the Ark in the synagogue. It also means the oral Torah. So many people ask, what is the oral Torah? So Rabeinu Yonah is going to tell us. Torah beferusha nitna. Because when Hashem gave us the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, He also gave an explanation for the Torah. Shebelo kain, because without the explanation, it's impossible to understand what the Torah is talking about. And I was going to say some examples. Sharai Kasav. It says in the Torah, lo sigzol. It says, don't steal. Okay, well, what's considered stealing? Rabeinu Yonah says, v'chol hanazikin b'chol oso alav. Included in this prohibition of not stealing is not only walking into someone's house and taking something, but also damaging something of someone else's. If you ram your car into your neighbor's car or his mailbox because he, cut down a tree on your lawn or something, and you ran over his mailbox and you rammed your car into his car, you violate the prohibition of not stealing. Now this is actually very interesting. V'heimen Torah, and it's a Torah commandment. This is a unique interpretation of Rabeinu Yonah. There's a whole discussion amongst the early commentaries what prohibition is violated if a person damages somebody else's belongings. But according to Rabeinu Yonah, one violates the prohibition of not stealing. So now it doesn't say that explicitly in the Torah, but it was given, its explanation was given when the written Torah was given. Al Pia Kabbalah Moshe Sinai was a Kabbalah from Moshe at Sinai. Va'afilu lo nichtavu, even though it wasn't written. Furthermore, it says, now it talks about a judge. What a judge has to make certain determinations when he judges a case, a rabbinical judge. And it says, bein dam ladam, he has to differentiate between blood and blood, bein din ladin, between the law and the law, ubein nega lanaga, and between different types of skin ailments, we'll say, or not only in the skin, but certain ailments, we'll say, can come on the skin, on the clothes, on the house. Now, what are these? Now, certain blood makes a person impure. That might come out of the body. Certain blood does not make a person impure. Right? This is relevant today for Hilchos Nida, but it was more relevant also back in the times when we had a temple, whether you could go into the temple, whether you could touch holy food. But the Torah just says that the judge makes differentiations between different types of blood. But Kamamar is damim. How many different types of blood are there? When it says the judge has to make determinations between different laws, how many laws are there in the Torah? Or details of the laws in Chesed Mishpat, in the monetary laws. Umaros Negayim, and how many different types of skin ailments that exist? That we know from Kabbalah. We know, but Kabbalah doesn't mean mysticism, it means an accepted tradition, right? If you look in the Talmud, we'll discuss soon what the Talmud is, but there's so many different types of different colors of blood. There are so many details of laws, monetary laws, right? What do you think? That's what people are doing when they're sitting in yeshiva. They're learning all these laws. And they were all, and they're not written anywhere in the Torah, because it wasn't meant to be written down. So if you look in the Torah, between the Torah, the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are not discussing the different types of blood, what it has to look like, and how much of it to make a person impure. That is only in the oral Torah. So the written Torah writes, the judge differentiates between the different types of blood and the different laws, but what those laws are and what the blood looks like and how it is, that's all found in the oral Torah. So another example he doesn't bring here, and then it's, okay, we'll stop for a second. So another example is tefillin. The Torah says to put it as a sign between your eyes, and and on your heart. So it doesn't say what that sign is. So we know, though, that it's tefillin. There are these black boxes that have different parshos from the Torah, different parts of the Torah written on them in a certain way, and in very specific parshos of the Torah, and even a specific order. But it doesn't say anywhere in the written Torah what the tefillin are, what they're supposed to be, what these signs are supposed to be. That is all found in the oral Torah. Someone told me a story once that I think it was a counselor in Camp Sports, that a person was reading the Torah, and it said that you have to put a sign between your eyes, and he walked in the next morning with a stop sign between his eyes because he wanted to fulfill what the Torah has to say. So the point that Rabeinu Yonah here is making is that the main ideas are written in the written Torah, and the explanations and the details of the laws are in the oral Torah. Now, why did God do it like that? So if you want to send me a message, we can talk about that. There's different explanation of why God did it like that, but that's the way that it is. So he cites the pasuk here. It says, "V'zehu shenamar." This is what it says. Ki al pi advarim ha'ela karsi itchabris. And with these words, I made my covenant with you. Zu Torah shebal peh. That's referring to the oral Torah. La'amedcha sheTorah shebal peh lo nitna likasev. To tell you that the Torah shebal peh, the oral Torah, is not to be written down. Uksiv. Now we'll discuss. It was written down eventually. We'll discuss why that is. Uksiv. It says, "Ve'etna lecha es luchos ha'evan v'Torah v'hamitzvos." The verse. Another verse says, "I will give to you the tablets, these stone tablets, the Torah and the mitzvah." What does that mean? Why does it say, "I'll give you Torah and mitzvah"? Torah, zu Torah shebiksav. Torah means the written Torah. V'ha mitzvah, mitzvah means zu Torah shebal peh. This is the oral Torah. That's what the Gemara in Brachos says. Nimseisa Omer is to say, Kol mitzvah shenitnu l'Moshe b'Sinai b'Ferusha nitna. Every mitzvah that was given to Moshe at Sinai, it was given with his explanation. V'hakasav hu shenikra Torah shebiksav. The verse is called the written Torah. V'haperish hu shenikra Torah shebal peh. And the explanation is called the oral Torah. Moshe lamda mipi agvura, and Moshe learned from Hashem. And then we say, okay, so that's the idea of the written Torah and the oral Torah. Now, what did Moshe do with it? Musar Yeshua, he gave it to Yeshua. Moshe Namar, it says in the verse, Misharso Yeshua benun nar le'yamish b'tocha oel, that Yehoshua was a young man and he did not leave from the tent. He served Moshe and did not leave from his tent. Yeshua Lezakanim, and we said Yeshua gave it to the elders. Moshe Namar, it says in the verse, Yeshua b'chol yimei hazakanim asher harichu yamim achar Yeshua, all the days of the elders that they were lengthened after Yeshua. Uzakanim l'navim u'navim u'masar l'anshei knesset hagadolim. And the elders gave it to the prophets, and the prophets gave it to the men of the great assembly. Now, who are the men of the great assembly? So Zehu Ezra v'siyato. This is Ezra and his group. Now Ezra was at the beginning of the second temple, right? We have, after the Jewish people were in Pesach, now after they left Egypt, they spent 40 years in the desert, and then they spent time conquering Israel, where they had the Mishkan first in various places like Shiloh, and then the temple was built in Jerusalem, lasted for about 410 years, was destroyed by the Babylonians. They were in 70 years of exile. That's where the Purim story happened. And then after that, they returned and built a second temple, which was again for about 420 years, but at the beginning of the second temple period was Ezra, and him and his group were the men of the greatest assembly. And from the prophets of the second temple, they were in this group. So now when we're saying that it was given, the men of the great assembly, amongst the men of the great assembly were prophets. Prophets means that God spoke to them directly. Prophecy ended shortly after this time. But up until the beginning of the second temple, you have people that spoke to Hashem, that Hashem spoke to them. We all speak to Hashem, but if Hashem speaks to you, then you're very special. But nowadays, if Hashem speaks to you, we might send you to a psychiatrist, because we don't have prophecy anymore. We have Ruach HaKodesh, which is something else. But back in the day, they had prophets that Hashem actually spoke to them. Now, these prophets were members. Some of these prophets were members of the men of the Great Assembly. Other things that the men of the Great Assembly did is that they set davening. They wrote davening, right? With their divine inspiration and the prophecy from God, they chose words that they knew would impact the spiritual world in the ultimate fashion when we daven. So we're saying that these men of the Great Assembly were instrumental in the passing of the tradition of Torah. And he's saying that included in them were many prophets. It says in the tractate Yevamos, Amar Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinis, Kisha Amar Chagei Shlosha Dvarim Halalu, when Chagai, the prophet Chagai, right, one of the last books of the Bible in the Nevi'im, when he said these three things, Al Maducha Zuhaya Yeshik, he was sitting on this mortar. Hine Kimin Hanavim Shal Bayesheni Achar Chorban Hayo. Because why? Because Chagai was from the prophets during the Second Temple period. Ki Chagai Anavi Hayasham, he was there. V'Anshe Knesset Hagadola Masur L'Chachmei Dorim. Now what happened? Now the Mishnah only goes up to the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, the men of the Great Assembly so far. Now who did they give it to after? So Masar L'Chachmei Dorim, they gave it over to the wise people of the generation. And those wise people gave it to their children after them. B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation. V'haisa hagabala mechacham l'chacham. So it was in the Jewish people through the Second Temple period and after the Second Temple period that every generation, the wise people of the generation, the scholars would give it over to their students and their children. Ad sheniskabtzu kol chachmei Yisrael. Now what happened? There was a time in Jewish history when the wise people of the Jewish people decided to get together, and they said, it's about time that we write down this oral Torah. Now, he doesn't say here, why did they do that? Because since after the destruction of the Second Temple, and the Jewish people were dispersed over the world, they didn't have a center anymore, we didn't have the center Israel, it became very difficult to transmit the oral Torah orally. So what they did is all of the wise people got together and they wrote it down. Now, what they wrote down would eventually become the Talmud. First they wrote the Mishnah, then they wrote the Gemara, but the Talmud, when you hear people talking about the Talmud, that is the conversations and that is the repository of the oral Torah, which, as Rabeinu Yonah just told us, is the explanation for the written Torah, the explanation for all of the mitzvahs. So he says that the wise people of the generation, they got together, and they wanted to write down the oral Torah, and they wrote and they sealed the Talmud. And after this, you can't add or subtract from anything. The Rambam also writes this. Once there was chasimas haTalmud, once the Talmud was sealed, right? You had certain debates within the Talmud. Different rabbis of the Talmud, one rabbi held like this, one rabbi held like that. Sometimes the Talmud explicitly says what the conclusion is, sometimes it doesn't. But once the Talmud has a conclusion, and since it was sealed, the reason is since it was agreed upon by all the Jewish people of the time, since all the Jewish people of the time, all the sages agreed, this is the final Jewish law, nobody after that is allowed to argue on it. So what we do now is we try to interpret the Talmud through the lens of the sages that came before us. But no rabbi will disagree with what the Talmud says. And if you hear of someone calling themselves a rabbi who does that, run away. Okay. Now, what did the generation of the Talmud do? What did they do? They gave it to the Gaonim. The rabbis that came after the time of the Talmud were called Gaonim. They primarily were in Iraq. And each leader of the generation or of the yeshiva was called a Gaon. We have names like Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Shri Gaon, and they wrote a lot of responsa. Although Jewish world all over, would send them questions and they would respond with their answers based on the interpretation of the Talmud. And then, so from the Gaon literally means a genius, from genius to genius, every generation would give it over. Rav Mipirav Adiyom Mazeh, and he says from teacher to teacher, from rabbi to rabbi until our day. And the Rabeinu Yonah was writing in the 1200s. And we know that, as I mentioned earlier, we have a chart from the 1200s on, or from all the way from Moshe Rabeinu. We have Kabbalah. We have a direct tradition of who taught the Torah all the way back to Moshe Rabeinu. Okay, so we'll stop here for today. So we're just learning Rabeinu Yonah's explanation. We talked about what the oral Torah is, how it's the explanation of the written Torah. We talked about more of the tradition of how the Torah came directly from Hashem to Moshe Rabeinu all the way to us. And we talked about what the Talmud is and how the Talmud is the repository of all oral law. And since the entire Jewish people agreed upon it, no one can argue on it anymore. And now when we study Torah, what we're trying to do is understand what the Talmud has to say. That you could have disagreements of the interpretation of the Talmud, but to actually, if the Talmud says you have to do the mitzvah, X, Y, Z, and you decide you have to do the mitzvah in a different way, that is something that is not allowed to be done, since at the time all of the Jewish people agreed that this is going to be the law, and that is binding. Now, if you want to know more about why that's binding, again, please send me a message. We'd love to talk about it, and wishing everyone a continued joyous Pesach.